Hello and welcome. As many of you know, I'm Sharon Flescher, Executive Director of IFAR. And on behalf of everyone at IFAR, our chairman, Tony Williams, our board and council, many of whom are here tonight, and our very, very hardworking staff and volunteers, I'd like to welcome you all to another IFAR evening. And I also want to especially thank Chubb tonight, and particularly Mary Sheridan and Laura Doyle for their support of this program. Well, frankly, the musical Hamilton has nothing on us tonight other than music and price. This program sold out within 3 days of our announcing the program. And we had an incredibly long wait list. As we got some cancellations at the very end, when we sent out that email, and mainly today, we tried to accommodate some of the people on the wait list, but we clearly couldn't accommodate all. It's incredible when you think it's the middle of summer, the supposedly dead period for the art world. But of course, I know the reason. It's because we have a very important topic and the right speakers. So I don't think any of you will be disappointed. For those of you who are here with us for the first time, I invite you to take a look at and take our literature outside in that waiting area where we'll also have our reception, and also check out our website, ifar.org. That way you can learn more about us. Perhaps you'll decide to subscribe to the IFAR Journal. And I'd like to show you the new issue is hot off the press right here. And those of you who do subscribe will get it in the mail. This one focuses on the ivory ban and lots of other articles that we're going to include. And who knows, maybe you'll even decide to become an IFAR supporter. We could certainly use that support to help us carry out all our good work for the public in the art community. And also then you'll be among the first to hear about these programs, which are usually sold out, although not as quickly as this one was, and you'll be able to come for free, which is a nice bonus. We'll be publishing an edited version of tonight's program in the journal, and we may post a video. That's not certain. So stay tuned. And by the way, when you're on our website, do check out our educational resources. And now for tonight's program, where I'm wearing two hats. This hat, welcoming you all, and I'm also speaking on the panel. This is, in fact, the very first time that I'll be speaking at an IFAR evening panel. But I am, and so of course I can't moderate, but in my stead, and much better, we hit the jackpot, and we got Patricia Cohen from the New York Times to moderate for us, and I think you'll all agree that was much better than me. And as you probably know, Ms. Cohen is the reporter who, in December 2011, effectively broke the Knoedler Rosales story in the Times, the newspaper where she's worked since 1998. She covered the Knoedler Rosales story and all the aspects of it extensively, and for that series and other articles on art forgery, she later won the International Annette Giacometti Prize. And at that time, she was an investigative reporter in the Times Cultural Department. She now covers the national economy for the newspaper. And her other credits, which are too numerous to mention here, but include stints at the Washington Post, New York Newsday, and even Rolling Stone magazine. That one surprised me. Patty will introduce the speakers who will speak in the order in which we're all seated tonight, and each of us is going to speak for approximately 10, maximum 15 minutes. And then Patty will moderate a discussion and open it up to questions. So please, we know there are going to be a lot of questions. Many of you had some involvement in this case. Please hold your questions until the end. And now it's with great pride that I introduce Patty Cohen. Thank you.
Let me first introduce our panelist here, who I also lovingly think of as my sources. So first is John Cahill, who actually has handled 4 of the Knoedler cases for people who bought some of the artworks. He's the former chairman of the Art Law Committee of the New York City Bar Association, and now he has his own practice. Sharon, of course, right next to him, as you know, she's the executive director of IFAR, and also the editor-in-chief of the IFAR Journal, and she's published and lectured extensively. Jamie Martin, who's a conservation scientist, his own firm is Orion, and was really the crucial firm in identifying the paintings as being forgeries. And in fact, even before any cases were brought, Jamie was the one who was the first to test one of the Motherwell paintings and found that it was not authentic. Then next time we have Adam Scheffer, who is a partner at Chime and Reed and president of the Art Dealers Association of America, and Rob Storr, who was a curator at MoMA, just very recently retired as dean at the art school at Yale, but is still a professor there. So there's really no better people than these who could tell you about the case. And let me just, by way of introduction, say one of the things that really struck me in covering this story over a number of years is that it takes much more than a very good imitative artist or even an outrageous con man to pull off something like this. It takes a village. And sometimes it's both with the witting help and also sometimes the unwitting help of a lot of people who really didn't know, but for a variety of reasons, contributed in some way to making people think that these were authentic paintings. People who really suspected something from the beginning were not able to say something because they were fearful of being sued. Some of the foundations involved had legal representatives who told them not to say anything. There were others who were paid or served to get a commission from some of the works if they were sold, and others, even if they weren't paid directly, were indirectly paid by Knoedler in the employ. So it's one of these cases that you look at in retrospect and seems impossible to have gone on for as long as it did, for 15 years, in kind of the middle of the art world like that. And yet, it's all of these catch-22s in terms of all of these obvious intervals when it seems the truth should have come out over that time and didn't. So anyway, let's start with John Cahill here, who is really probably the best to give you an introduction to this.
Good evening and thank you. It's always a pleasure to be with IFAR, which is a great organization. You should send your checks in just as soon as you get your textbooks out. And I have the job tonight of, in 10 minutes, or maybe a little more, but giving you the entire history of the case, the facts and the law. And so I'm going to go really fast. Some of you may have read the New York Times from time to time, so you'll know some of the facts. But every once in a while you meet people who haven't, so I'm going to try and cover the things as best I can. Because I'm a lawyer, in the Knoedler case, in fact, this happened. Sometimes when I speak or write things, I find those things spoken back to me in brief saying, he said this. So I'm here to tell you that this is not legal advice. This isn't the gospel according to me. It's just, some of them are my opinions, some of them are the facts. And the goal of this program, Sharon asked us all to do, is not to engage in a festival of recrimination and blame here, although that's always fun. Some of that might come out here or there. But really to put this in context for you so we can have a discussion about the lessons that were learned and things we can think about and have a thought-provoking conversation. So I'll race through these things a little bit. Hopefully if there are things I skip over that you're interested in, we can cover them in the question and answer period. But I'll get through as much as I can, and we'll hopefully at least put some of this in context for you. So fakes and forgeries, no, not a new thing, didn't start with Knoedler. Romans were doing it to the Greeks. It's happened in the early 20th century. Some of you know the Larry Gagosian of his time, Sir Joseph Duveen. He bought what was supposed to be a fake Leonardo, or he called something a fake Leonardo and got sued for it. There are other people who've gotten stung by fates more recently. Some of you know this guy, Wild and Crazy. He bought this thing which was supposed to be a Campendonk. It turns out it wasn't. It was made by a guy named Beltracchi. And this is an important question, and this is the question we want to answer here tonight, is who's responsible for this, and who does take responsibility? So that's my first bullet point, my first thought-provoking question is, Steve Martin said, yeah, I bought a fake. In fact, he had bought a couple of fakes. He actually is a very serious art collector, and they even curated a show. He's quite a serious guy in that regard. But he frankly I think he was interviewed by the Times. He didn't know what would happen. I think the gallery did cover him, but it's an issue. So here's a rogues gallery of forgers. Beltracchi, who Orion was involved in unmasking. Maybe you saw the 60 Minutes episode. Here's Hans von Meegeren, my personal favorite, said he wasn't cooperating with the Nazis because he sold them a forgery. The most elegant forger, he's been in films. John Myatt faked a lot of provenance. Ken Perenyi, who, remember his name because he'll feature again with one of the main characters in the main but little-known characters in the Knoedler story. And here's our Knoedler forger, the main Knoedler forger. He's the one who did these works, the dozens of them that were in the case, including the one behind me, which is owned by a collector, which was supposed to have been a Rothko, but which isn't. So he painted that and many, many other things. So he apparently, on the street, met this gentleman, Jose Carlos Bergantinos, who decided he wanted to sell some forgeries. He was sometimes referred to as the husband, sometimes the boyfriend of Glafira Rosales, and I'm here to tell you he's not good boyfriend material. He flew the country. Rosales had to plead guilty to a crime and is awaiting sentencing, but he's in Spain, and wouldn't you know it, he got too sick to come back to the United States to answer federal charges against him. So they haven't extradited him yet. I think they're still trying, but his brother, who was involved in laundering some of the proceeds of this fraud, will get back. So Glafira knew this gentleman on the left, I guess it's the left, Jamie Andrade, who worked at Knoedler. And at Knoedler, he brought Glafira Rosales, where he introduced Rosales to Anne Friedman. And Anne Friedman was the director of the Knoedler Gallery, and she had been for a long time, was a very highly regarded, important gallery director. And she started selling works that Rosales brought to her. And she sold them at art fairs, she sold them privately, and it was a pretty good deal for her. They were making very big profits. So, for example, one of my clients, John Howard, bought what was supposed to be a de Kooning for $4 million on a Wednesday, which Knoedler bought on a Tuesday, the Tuesday before, for $700,000. So that's a pretty good profit margin. For those of you who are art dealers, we have an art dealer president here. That's a very substantial profit. The total revenues, not just from Knoedler, there was another dealer involved named Julian Reisman, $80 million for these dozens of fakes. That comes also from the indictment. So how did people start to find out about this? Well, the Daedalus Foundation had actually authenticated a work by Motherwell. The Daedalus Foundation is involved with the work of Robert Motherwell. And a dealer, which uses the word Kalela, but Mark Blondeau, wound up suing the Daedalus Foundation for having mistakenly authenticated a Motherwell, and Julian Weissman. That got the FBI interested, and the FBI started investigating, and that caused Michael Hammer, who owned the Knoedler Gallery. The Knoedler Gallery, by the way, is a very old gallery. It's older than the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was really established, the first gallery in the 19th century. It's a very, very old gallery, but it was bought by the Hammer family. Maybe some of you remember Armand Hammer, who was kind of a famous or infamous industrialist billionaire in the 20th century. Hammer, when he got wind of this FBI investigation, he apparently decided to close down the sale of works that came from Rosales and from another fellow named Masaccio, who we'll talk about in just a second. But it was all done pretty quietly, no big fuss. And Anne Friedman left the gallery. And he refused to talk about it, said the gallery's fine, and she wasn't fired, and no one knew much about it. But meanwhile, the FBI was quietly investigating. Hammer, meanwhile, who was eventually sued, but eventually got out of the suit, did manage to get a little money out of these huge numbers of profits. During discovery, it was learned that he bought $1 million worth of cars alone, a Rolls Royce, and people were speculating it was a Mercedes. I don't think they found out. The other forgery, and this is the thing that you don't hear too much about, but that's interesting because you had the one we call the Chinese forger, who, by the way, fled to China and has not come back since and is under indictment. There was another person named Anthony Masaccio. He's the one on the left. He's the good-looking guy, and he's a friend of Ken Perenyi, and he features in a book by Ken Perenyi, in which he brags about being a forger. And Masaccio was painting works like this, which is a fake de Kooning, which hangs in my office now. And like Rosales, he would go in and he would say, give me $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. Very often in cash, and when it's in less than $10,000 in cash. If you want to know why that's the case, go back and look at our former New York governor and watch The Sopranos, because if you get cash, you deposit less than $10,000, the feds don't notice it as easily. So that's really criminal behavior. When the FBI was investigating, they decided to stop selling these works. So things were quiet for a while, and then a gentleman named Pierre Lagrange decided to sell a Pollock he'd bought for $17 million. Sotheby's, Christie's, nobody would sell it. The Knoedler Gallery and Ann Friedman, who was the director, said, they don't know what they're talking about. So he tried to sell it, and he went back to try to find out what the provenance was. And here's what the provenance that he and most of the other victims were told, that it came directly from the artist or their studio. It went to a private collection, and the private collection was actually an anonymous Swiss gay Mexican gentleman who did this all quietly because of the whole gay thing, which apparently was not welcome back in the 50s when he was doing it, or the early 60s, as they later changed the story. And at first they said it came from another artist named Osorio, but that didn't work out. And this collector, this private collector, came to be known at Knoedler as Mr. X. Sometimes he's referred to as Secret Santa. These are from the actual files of Knoedler. But what Knoedler didn't tell people is that they didn't tell about anything about Rosales. They didn't say anything that they'd first been told there were only 8 works that eventually grew to over 40. They didn't disclose that in 2003, IFAR, which you'll hear about from Sharon, had said that Osorio could have had nothing to do with these artworks. They didn't disclose that the provenance was surmised, which might be another way of saying made up. They didn't disclose that they didn't know who the Swiss Mexican gay collector was, or his supposed son, or that there were other people involved. The only person who got that was actually Orion, who has a contract that says, in order for me to look at your painting, you have to tell me you know the owner and that you have the owner's permission. So when Lagrange eventually got frustrated that he couldn't sell it, he hired Orion to have a look at this work. And Orion, which you'll hear more about in detail, figured out with their microscopes, this is a very nerdy picture of Jamie, but he figured out that there were pigments in that, and everything's not in exact order, but there's another painting, this one is one of my clients, it has a lot of yellow in it, that there were pigments that weren't marketed, weren't patented at the time, that they were supposedly painted. So we thought that was pretty good information, but and Orion eventually published a report on that. This is the summary of it, but it basically deals with anachronistic pigments. But Knoedler wasn't impressed about that. They were not at all impressed, and there was a lot of published. This is actually not by Patricia Cohen, it's by Kevin Flynn, but one of the Friedman lawyers said, we're prepared to demonstrate the work is genuine. So that was their first defense. They're real. And they said this was based on experts. They had lots of experts. Here's a guy named Nicholas Eastaugh, who does the kind of thing that Orion does, Jamie Martin does. He said the whole thing about the anachronistic pigments, that's much more complicated. Maybe, he said, there were other things that could have been supplied with these pigments, even though they didn't exist at the time, they were patented. There were experimental paints, maybe they were given out at the Cedar Tavern when all these guys were drinking, who knows. But basically that the pigments existed, so maybe they got mixed together somehow and got into all these paintings. For those of you who watched TV in the 70s, this is the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup commercial where they would just bump into each other. So somehow that happened. Problem is, Mr. Eastaugh, when he was looking at the matter Pollock, said the chances of that really happening in that context were negligible. And of course, he turned out to be right in that case and not in this case. Likewise, they hired a guy with a PhD, another chemist, people who found looked into the works of the Shroud of Turin, and they said, look, similar to that anachronistic pigment, but not really close enough. But they didn't produce their lab notes originally, which said it was a good match. So when Ann Friedman was asked why she thought these things were real, she said, well, it's the scholars. It's a consensus of scholars. And who are these folks? Some leading scholars in the sense of, they were real people. They had either had PhDs or they'd written books. One of them was a conservator, not really a scholar, but unlike most conservators, she actually sort of opined on the authenticity of the works, or it seemed to, by saying how great they were. So despite all this, and defending that they thought it was real, Knoedler one night announced that they were closing the gallery, right in the middle of an exhibition, and right in the middle of Mr. Lagrange filing a lawsuit. Very early in that case, Ann Friedman got to testify, and someone, me, asked her, look, how do you know these weren't painted in a garage? And she said, well, because I believe they're authentic and by the artist. And here's the garage they were painted in. So there were eventually about a dozen lawsuits. There were several lawsuits filed. There was an FBI investigation. People were indicted. A bunch of people didn't sue, about 15 people. Why? Embarrassed, costs. Some people might have been trying to sell them. And the basic legal claims were that the contract, the warranty that comes with every painting had been breached, and failing that all these folks had been involved in a massive fraud, including the gallery, including the person who painted the paintings, including the dealers who sold them, etc. And here's a list of some of the things that wound up in the legal papers. The defense was, well, first it was they're real, then there's not enough evidence that they're fake, then your suit is too late, and then finally it was, look, you just made a mistake in trusting us. You shouldn't have believed us. That's the Animal House defense, for those of you who are familiar with that great John Landis film, which is, you muffed up, you trusted us, and that's really that you relied on, in order to have a fraud, you have to rely. If I try and sell you the Brooklyn Bridge, you shouldn't believe me. No one should believe that. All the victims said, we went into a really fancy art gallery. You told us it was real. We believed you. And they said, well, you shouldn't have. While this was happening, another judge in the federal courts actually said, well, for an art dealer, that may be true. An art dealer bought a painting. It turned out to be fake. They didn't go and check with the expert beforehand, and they weren't able to recover. But all this changed when the FBI got financial records from Rosales and Bergantino's in Spain, and it turned out she never sent any money to anyone gay, Swiss, Mexican, or their heirs. So she wound up being in jail for a while. While she was in jail, she reflected, and she pled guilty, and she spilled the beans. That caused the gallery and its director to say, we're the victims. Please feel sorry for us. Several people raised the question, well, if you're a victim, can you at least give our money back? And that didn't work. They didn't give the money back. Neither Hammer nor Friedman nor the gallery gave the money back. They spent it on legal fees, fighting not to give the money back. So, in the quick few seconds I have left, I'll just give you some quick thoughts and things we can think about as lessons for when you hear the other speakers speak. One lesson is you should rely on good people. And there were some good people here, and I do want to say, I consider James Martin a friend, but I can say honestly, and I think most people agree with me, that this scandal would never have been uncovered without him. And not only is it a tribute to his technical skill, there was a lot of courage in doing this. They attacked him quite viciously, and if you've read some of the press on it, and so never did someone deserve it less, but he courageously stood by it and he saw it through, and it turned out he was 100% right, and all the other folks were 100% wrong. Everything he said from the very beginning turned out to be absolutely correct, and that's what carried the day here. IFAR also, which is a very confidential organization, they hate to talk. Jack Flam, and there were some dealers who, look, they made mistakes, but at least they gave their money back. Quick advice in a nutshell, get a contract when you buy art for a lot of money. I don't know what a lot of money is to you, but if it's a lot, it's worth doing, it's not that expensive. And be specific. One of the contracts that Ann Friedman didn't sign said, look, tell me that you've told me everything you know about the paintings and you don't know anything negative. And she said, I'm never going to sign that. These contracts are silly. My invoice is my bond. But if she couldn't have signed that because she knew that in 2003, IFAR courageously had said, we don't think this Pollock is real. We don't think it can stand up as a Pollock. And just as people thinking about the law, and for those of people who do think about the law, it's not just for lawyers. I kind of think of it the way you think of engineering as applied science, law as applied philosophy and civics. So we can think about what kind of law we want to have. And the the defendants in these cases and a lot of people in the press said, look, a bunch of rich people buying things my kid could do, you know, you should have gotten better advice. You shouldn't just relied on them. I think you could consider rejecting that. Also protecting experts. A lot of people did see these things, didn't opine on them in the way that the defendants in the cases said they did, but they were afraid to speak. And I think we've got some legislation pending that will help that, but there should be other things that could be done to help protect experts. So back in 29, when Duveen was sued, they worried about this, the silencing of expert opinions, and you see with the closing of catalog raisonné committees, et cetera, that may be happening. So it's important that experts get to do their things, even if they're wrong, even if they give the wrong opinions, they should be protected. So with that, I will turn it over to the next speaker. I think I hit my mark as fast as I could. Hopefully, if you have questions, you will. But the other obvious point is the reason we should care about the art is and the authenticity of it is because the artist created it, and it does make a difference that Rothko did not paint that work, and hopefully it makes a difference to you as well.
As you've already heard, in 2003, IFAR wrote an authentication report on one of the purported Pollocks acquired by the Knoedler Gallery from Glafira Rosales. See the slide here. The painting was submitted to us by a private owner, Jack Levy, whose name was made public not by us, but years later by our Patty Cohen in the New York Times. Mr. Levy had purchased the painting from Knoedler for $2 million, and because it wasn't in the catalog raisonné, he wisely extracted a condition which we did not know about, that he would submit the work to IFAR, and if we didn't support the Pollock attribution, it would be returned to Knoedler. Ever since the Pollock-Krasner Foundation stopped reviewing works by Pollock for its catalog raisonné supplement, having been hit with 3 lawsuits, many Pollock inquiries were coming to IFAR's Authentication Research Service, which we've maintained since our founding in 1969. After considerable research, we sent a report to Mr. Levy saying that, quote, too many reservations exist to make a positive attribution to Jackson Pollock. We later learned that he returned the work and got his money back. That was 10 years before Rosales admitted that this work and approximately 60 others were fakes. We involved many specialists in the project, and we also undertook extensive research on our own. Per our usual practice, we examined the work from the point of view of scholarship, material properties, and style, that is, connoisseurship. Like many of the Rosales works, the painting was a pretty good fake, and there were some positive comments about it which we felt duty-bound to include in our report. But there were also serious concerns about the style, the materials, the absolute lack of documentation, not just provenance, but any documentation, letters, dealer records, interviews, photographs, anything linking the work to Pollock, although it was dated 1949, and thus purportedly painted at the height of Pollock's career. This was the time when Life magazine was asking whether he was the most famous painter in America. He's also one of the best documented. So the absence of documentation for a Pollock, while not determinative, can't simply be dismissed, as apparently it was by others. So since we're talking about lessons here tonight, let's call that lesson number 1. Stylistic concerns range from the way the paint layers interacted with each other and the canvas edges to the unusual color and application, and you can easily see this, of the thin brownish-green background wash, which made no sense at all in context of Pollock's career at that time. The latter point troubled even those people who otherwise kind of liked the work. The materials were also troubling. The painting, for example, is on canvas mounted on masonite, but when compared with an unquestioned Pollock of the same date, also canvas on masonite, there were disturbing differences. Where the canvas in Mr. Levy's work was mounted on the rough side of the masonite, which was left raw, in the true Pollock, it was mounted on the smooth side of the masonite. And Pollock added sizing So I'm comparing the two in a detail where both of them had rather similar signature, as a matter of fact. Pollock added sizing to his masonite, which you can easily see, which had visibly darkened and aged over the years. So there was a dramatic contrast between the two masonite supports, and this also couldn't be ignored. Also troubling was the way the canvas in Mr. Levy's work was abraded in some areas before the paint was even applied. In other words, newer paint over older support. In itself, this wasn't damning. In fact, none of these points in themselves were damning. But it was troubling, and they add up. We elected not to do forensic tests because in 2003, comparative baseline information for Pollock's pigments and binders wasn't available to us. Such baseline information can reveal anomalies, that is, inconsistencies with an artist's known works. In addition, it seemed unlikely that forensic tests, which we believe in but use judiciously, would actually uncover anachronistic materials in this case. Of course, had we known that this painting was part of a large group of undocumented works by modern masters that had suddenly turned up and were being marketed, that alone would have raised the specter of fraud, which would have warranted forensic tests despite the limited chance of finding anything. But we only knew of our work from this group and learned of a second being marketed in the course of our research. The same was true for many other people over the years who viewed individual works from the group. This limited knowledge helped the scam succeed. This is another lesson that I hope we can return to later. Also, let's not forget that some, not all, of what we know now about anomalous and anachronistic materials in Pollock has been learned since the matter paintings were tested beginning 2005. But of course, as you've already heard, as it happens, years later, as part of a much larger investigation, Jamie Martin did find anachronistic elements in many of these fakes. So testing might have been fruitful after all. We did, however, undertake fractal analysis on the painting, and the results were negative, meaning that the Levy painting did not manifest the fractal patterns or ratio of fractal patterns that some people believe are present in Pollock's poured or drip paintings. But the jury is out even today on the validity of fractal analysis as a means of determining authenticity in Pollock's works. It's still controversial, and we too are not convinced of its validity. Thus, in an exercise of caution, knowing that our negative report was going to create a stir, and it did, we elected not to mention the fractal analysis so as not to deflect the discussion from our other concerns. It didn't matter, though, as the Knoedler Gallery badmouthed us and our report for years. Anyway, and moreover, our report, as you've already heard, was hidden from potential buyers. Now let's turn to provenance, the aspect of IFAR's report that's gotten the most press. The work was submitted to us with a provenance mentioning Alfonso Osorio, Pollock's friend and early patron, but there was no supporting documentation. The statements were vague and contradictory. We investigated the Osorio connection from every possible angle and couldn't substantiate it. We wrote that. While it's theoretically possible for a recent authentic work to lack a verifiable provenance, it's unlikely. That's a red flag, which you can't ignore, although apparently Ms. Friedman did. In fact, when I contacted her in the course of our research to get more provenance information, she expressed surprise that we were even researching the provenance. When it comes to provenance and everything else, you have the right to your own opinions, but not your own facts. I learned 10 years later at my deposition in 2013 that within less than 3 weeks after we sent our report, the painting miraculously had a new provenance, David Herbert. That had just as little basis in fact as did the Osorio provenance. Both were concocted, and both were refutable with research. Provenance isn't a deck of cards You can't just reach in and grab for another one when the card you're dealt doesn't suit you. There is a methodology to art history. In fact, we now know that the gallery's own researchers, including Stephen Polcari, a specialist they hired, tried to, but couldn't substantiate the provenance either. But that too was ignored. So this is another lesson. You have to go where the research leads you and be objective and open-minded to what you find. If you can't substantiate your provenance but still believe in a work, say that. It will surely lower the price, but at least it'll be honest. At trial, Professor Polcari objected to the fact that as part of IFAR's research, we contacted Osario's longtime partner, Ted Dragon, who, of course, had never seen the work. Polcari admitted on the witness stand that IFAR's conclusions were right, but said they were right for the wrong reasons. I beg to differ. We were right for the right reasons. Now for some closing points. The imprimatur of the Venerable Knoedler Gallery allowed the scam to go forward. And while we should trust respected galleries and dealers, and frankly some of the best and most respected are right here in this audience tonight, a healthy degree of skepticism now and then really wouldn't hurt. So that maybe is another lesson. Still another one. Getting embroiled in authenticity disputes is expensive and time-consuming, but it's important for all of us to answer that call. IFAR has insurance to protect us from lawsuits regarding our opinions, but we learned to our dismay that insurance doesn't help when you're subpoenaed, deposed, and asked to testify as a fact witness. But you still need legal advice, and that's expensive, and we're a small and, alas, not wealthy nonprofit organization. Fortunately, wonderful pro bono help, legal counsel came to our rescue. And I want to publicly acknowledge here 2 attorneys who helped us, Peter Stern from McLaughlin & Stern and Gonzalo Zeballos from Baker Hostetler, and both are here tonight. I mentioned that we and most specialists who examined these paintings were working in a vacuum by knowing of only 1 or 2 works. But in addition, many of us didn't know that other specialists had already raised doubts about the works. Even before IFAR, the authenticity of some Diebenkorns in the group was questioned. But we didn't know that. IFAR was only informed of the positive opinions. The work had come into us with written endorsements by E.A. Carmian and Stephen Polcari. So we felt we were swimming against the tide when we sent our report. And as I said, our report too was suppressed. I hope we can return to this later. And now my final point. In authenticity research, the burden of proof is on the work to show that it is by the artist, not vice versa. In the case of Mr. Levy's work, we couldn't absolutely prove that it was a fake and hammer that nail in the coffin. But then, not every work that's excluded from a catalog raisonné is proven to be a fake. It just doesn't meet the bar for acceptance. Where there are too many doubts, you can't accept it. End of story. I underscore this because IFAR's conclusions were later twisted. Even recently, in an interview in the art newspaper, Anne Friedman said that IFAR, quote, couldn't determine whether the work was authentic or not, implying that we didn't state an opinion about the Levy painting. Not so. As I wrote in my responding letter to the editor, we said 3 times in our report, and again in my cover letter accompanying that report, that we could not accept the work as a work by Pollock. Sorry, that is an opinion, and the gallery would have done well to heed it as Mr. Levy did. Thank you.
Anyone that's taking notes for Anne Friedman, please read the disclaimer on the bottom of the slide. In late 2007, Jack Flam and the Daedalus Foundation, who were busy compiling the catalog raisonné of Robert Motherwell's paintings, They had extreme doubts about seven works with the same strange provenance. A secret Mexican-Swiss collection, supposedly stored in a hermetically sealed vault since 1959. Anne Friedman, then president of Knoedler & Company, owned one of the seven works. Knoedler & Company owned the other. The Daedalus Foundation insisted that Friedman retain me to examine the works, which she did through Knoedler. Most people at the time, including me, did not know that Knoedler, under Friedman's direction, since 1994, had sold nearly 40 works from the secret collection for more than $60 million. Scholars had expressed reasonable doubts about stylistic attribution and evolving provenance of the collection, but their doubts were either ignored or refuted by Knoedler and Friedman. Remarkably, mine would be the first technical examination of any of the works from the secret collection. Technical examination of works of art was not novel in 1998 or 1994 or any time after 1928, when the conservation discipline was established at Harvard. During the years Knoedler sold works from the secret collection, I was examining authenticity for the FBI, Knoedler's competitor galleries, auction houses, museums, and conservators throughout New York City and the United States. Using microscopes and spectrometers, I found that the works Friedman and Knoedler owned had been created with water-based synthetic paints. Robert Motherwell began using these kinds of paints in about 1962 or 63. The problem was that the works were dated 1953 and 1955 and had been deliberately altered to appear older than they were. In other words, the works contained historically inaccurate materials, which raised serious questions about who painted the works and when. Knoedler dismissed my findings as conjecture, and they asked me to prepare a redacted report for the Daedalus Foundation that modified or omitted my conclusions. I refused. Knoedler also claimed that they'd found new information since they had received my report, that the secret collection had entered the hermetically sealed vault later than 1959, now as late as 1964, which accommodated my findings. This marked the second or third time that provenance had evolved to accommodate adverse, independent findings about the works. My work for Friedman and Knoedler ended in 2009. It felt like 1909. About the time that a federal grand jury issued subpoenas to them seeking information about the secret collection. In response to the subpoenas, Knoedler let Friedman go, and they quietly marked their inventory not for sale. The next year, Jack Flam asked me to examine another one of the 7 purported Motherwell works, which the Daedalus Foundation now believed to be a forgery. This third work had been sold by Julian Weissman, who was a former Knoedler employee. I found this work also had been created with the same synthetic water-based paints and had been deliberately altered to appear old. Like Friedman's work, this work was dated 1953. These findings prompted the first lawsuit involving the secret collection. The lawsuit accused Weissman of acquiring works from an obscure Long Island dealer named Rosales, who, unlike Knoedler, was an improbable source of 40 secret works by abstract expressionist masters. The lawsuit settled in 2011 with the work declared a forgery, which the New York Times reported with a photograph of the back of the work, which Daedalus had indelibly stamped as a forgery. As this news spread, other collectors who had bought works from Knoedler and Weissman became nervous. In November 2011, British hedge funder Pierre Lagrange asked me to examine a work signed Pollock, which Knoedler had sold him for $17 million. I found that the work was created with paints and pigments first introduced in the 1960s and 70s. The problem was that the work was created or dated 1950, and Jackson Pollock died in 1956. Attorneys for LaGrange immediately sent my report to Knoedler, which abruptly closed the next day, permanently, amidst rumors that the once venerable gallery had been selling forgeries for years. Between 2011 and 2013, I was asked to examine over 20 more works from the secret collection, most sold by Knoedler. The next work I examined was a work signed Mark Rothko, which Knoedler sold to Domenico Desolé for $8.3 million in 2002, soon after IFAR had concluded that the initial provenance for the secret collection was implausible, unsupportable. I found that the work was created with paint colored with a red pigment that was introduced more than a decade after the work was purportedly created, and that would be 1956. But disturbingly, a clue that Rothko had not painted the work had always been clearly visible, but surprisingly never questioned by Knoedler or its experts. A white primer was clearly visible between the canvas and the paint. The problem was that Rothko didn't use a white primer in the 1950s. And curiously, the same white primer was used for other works in the secret collection, which suggested that one painter had created many works in the style of Motherwell and Rothko. Desolé sued Knoedler when they refused to refund his $8.3 million. The lawsuit, which was combined for a time with a similar lawsuit by John Howard, which John Cahill mentioned earlier, claimed a criminal conspiracy on the part of Knoedler, Friedman, Rosales, and others. As an expert witness in the lawsuit, I wrote an exhaustive report that detailed my examinations of 18 works purportedly created by Robert Motherwell, Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Lee Krasner, Willem de Kooning, and Barnett Newman. In addition to suspicious signatures, like the misspelled signature on a purported Pollock that Friedman owned, Pollock spelled his last name with a C, I found common reuse of old paintings, deliberate alteration, and the same historically inaccurate materials in works attributed to 5 different artists in 2 different decades. I concluded that all the works were deliberate fakes that had come from a common source. In other words, the same studio. Three months later, the New York Times identified the forger as Pei Shen-ken, who painted out of his home and garage in Queens, which was about 11 miles from Knoedler Gallery, which also was a short drive for Rosales, who arrived at Knoedler from time to time with works of art in the back of her station wagon. Within a month of the New York Times story, Rosales pleaded guilty to wire fraud and money laundering as part of an art fraud conspiracy that sold more than 60 fake works for more than $80 million. Rosales agreed to forfeit her $33 million in proceeds, and she awaits sentencing. She faces up to 99 years in prison. With the secret collection declared fake, Friedman claimed that she was the central victim of the fraud. Friedman chilled public criticism of her due diligence, which failed to detect more than 40 fake works, by initiating a defamation lawsuit against an acquaintance, who in the same exclusive story about Friedman commented, quote, "This has ruined one of the greatest galleries in the world. It trashed a lot of people's money. It seems to me Miss Friedman was totally irresponsible, and it went on for years. Imagine people coming to you and saying, every painting you sold me is a fake. It is an unthinkable situation. It's completely insane. A gallery person has an absolute responsibility to do due diligence, and I don't think she did it." In 2013, I was a scientific expert in more than 8 lawsuits and the government's expert in the ongoing criminal investigation. For Knoedler and Friedman, it seemed to me that the Desolé lawsuit was win at all costs. Between 2013 and 2016, attorneys and experts working from them were paid an estimated $2 million to attempt to discredit me and my work. The attorneys deposed me 3 separate times, and their experts combed through more than 8,000 pages of documents that I produced in response to 6 federal subpoenas. Finding no fault in me or my work, they resorted to fictitious allegations of criminal misconduct, which could result in my imprisonment. Their efforts failed. In February, I told a federal jury about my work for Friedman and Knoedler and for clients to whom they sold forgeries. The next day, Friedman settled her part of the lawsuit before she could be questioned publicly, under oath, about how Knoedler, under her direction, had sold historically inaccurate works backed by shape-shifting provenance and careless connoisseurs on retainers, but no technical or scientific examination, and how the gallery had handed Rosales cash in amounts under $10,000 while wired millions to her boyfriend's brother in Spain. A few days later, the whole trial ended abruptly after Knoedler settled its part of the lawsuit. The jury never weighed the evidence and decided whether Friedman and Knoedler were guilty of criminal conspiracy under the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, which allows the leaders of a syndicate to be tried for the crimes which they ordered others to do or assisted them to do. The criminal investigation remains open. A few remaining lawsuits likely will settle. But if Friedman had included technical examination in her due diligence concerning the secret collection, then this repugnant chapter in the history of New York art market probably would not have been written, and Sharon probably would have us discussing something else tonight. Knoedler will not be the last art forgery scandal to shake the art world. As Hans von Meegeren knew what pigments to avoid and Vermeers he sold to Nazis, present-day forgers glean technical information on the internet and submit fakes to laboratory testing to produce fakes aimed at thwarting scientific detection. Last year, Jules Francois Farallon published Forger, a book in which the main character is taught by a master forger who, being eerily knowledgeable about modern technical examination, instructs how to frustrate and hopefully fool scientists like me. The Knoedler-Rosales affair was identified, exposed, and ended when the disciplines of scientific connoisseurship, provenance research, and technical examination, the 3 essential parts of scholarly art authentication, when they came together in the fierce defense of art history and the artist who made that history. Thank you.
Thank you, Patty, for your introduction, and many thanks to Sharon and to IFAR for welcoming me on behalf of the Art Dealers Association of America to join you this evening. I'm Adam Scheffer, president of the Art Dealers Association of America and partner at the Chime & Reed Gallery. And thank you for including me in such a distinguished group of panelists. For those who may not know, the ADAA is a non-profit membership organization that supports the economic and cultural contributions of the nation's leading art galleries. Our membership includes about 180 art dealers from cities across the United States, representing thousands of established and emerging artists from the US and internationally. Art dealers, as we know, play a critical and multifaceted role in both the international art market and the cultural community, from nurturing artists throughout their careers to advancing scholarship, to mounting major exhibitions and inviting the public to engage freely with incredible works of art. Galleries foster and represent the relationships that power the art world. It's that second fact, that dealers' connoisseurship and the advancing of scholarship that is central to dealers' conversations and responses to Knoedler. But before delving too deeply into that discussion, it is first essential to note that this case is an anomaly. Without doubt, a very unfortunate one, but an anomaly nonetheless. In my more than 25 years of experience as an art dealer, I have never seen anything like this. In fact, quite the opposite is true. The dealers I know and work alongside are extremely diligent in their work. And this situation is not representative of the field of art dealers, nor reflective of the expertise, ethics, and best practices upheld by the ADAA. While there were a number of factors and individuals at play in this situation between the Knoedler Gallery and Rosales, in my opinion, this instance seemed to epitomize the saying, if it seems too good to be true, it probably is. And let's remember, none of us were there, none of us participated, and this is still being resolved by the legal system. For the sake of stating the obvious, every work of art is a distinct object, so there's no single guidebook that dictates how to authenticate every work of art. While that fact presents certain challenges for art dealers, the ADAA's standards and practices and code of ethics require all members to exercise due diligence in verifying the authenticity of works of art they offer for sale. Though due diligence can be open to interpretation, from our perspective at the ADAA, sound art historical research, connoisseurship, and scientific analysis are integral to the work of an art dealer when encountering questions of authenticity. Advancing art historical research and our collaborations with scholars and people like Jamie are some of the key elements of the work that an art dealer do, particularly when assessing a work's provenance. Look, it's my hope that if there's a silver lining from this situation, it's the reinforcement of the fundamental role that those activities, research, scholarly collaborations, scientific analysis play in the art world. Dealers, scholars, researchers, individuals, and institutions must work together as the foundation of our business. And this conversation has become much more robust as a result of what happened with the Knoedler Gallery. As a general rule for ADAA members, if there are claims against a member that they have violated our code of ethics, which includes the point on due diligence and authenticity, that claim will be investigated and proven. A proven violation can be grounds for censure, suspension, or expulsion from the association. In addition to the rules laid out in our code of ethics, the ADAA considered the claims against Knoedler very seriously from the beginning, and took actions to protect the arts community, collectors, dealers, the public, etc., from situations like this happening again, particularly in terms of exhibition at art fairs. For the art show, the ADAA's annual art fair, in particular, immediately following the first accusation against Knoedler in 2011, the ADAA changed its procedures and strengthened the guidelines for how the association addresses a situation when a work on display at a fair does not meet the approval of the art show committee in its sole discretion. Let's remember that the ADAA is not a policing or vetting organization, and it's expected that all our members comply with the code of ethics. Also, these works were exhibited in museums, not just art fairs. Every exhibitor now is required to sign a contract that states that they understand that the ADAA has the right to order any work displayed by the gallery that does not meet the approval of the art show committee to be withdrawn from the fair. The exhibitors also agree that their booth may be evaluated for authenticity by people designated by the ADAA whose identities are not disclosed, and that evaluation may be used in the ADAA's sole discretion for, among other things, determining participation in future art shows or even membership. While this may go without saying, also within the fair's contract, each exhibitor now agrees that it has no reason to believe that any work displayed is not authentic, misattributed, or a forgery. I cannot stress enough how central art historical research and connoisseurship are to the work that we do as art dealers. Connoisseurship comes from a dealer's depth of experience working with particular artists, schools, and periods over time. It's crucial that this nuanced eye work hand in hand with careful research, as well as the advancing scientific analysis that Jamie has addressed, each reinforcing and supporting one another. It's upon the basis of these best practices, sophisticated skills, and sound judgment that art dealers build lasting relationships of support and trust with artists, collectors, and the cultural community more broadly, and that these strong, long-held relationships that ensure galleries' success distinguish their vital role in the art world. In light of that, we are proud at the ADAA that our members uphold the best practices in the field. And as a community of peers with a common set of standards and practices, we approach any possible violation of these practices carefully and very seriously. Thank you.
I'm going to make a couple of remarks which are not totally extemporaneous and have been reflected on, but I'm not going to read a statement. I've been asked here to talk about how all these things reverberate in maybe other domains, and to use a dreadful word that's widely used in the art critical world, I'm going to problematize things. They're pretty problematic already, but I'm going to make them a little bit more so. It's significant that this case and many such cases are about handmade paintings, and particularly about the abstract expressionist paintings in this case, as was true of the purported matter paintings, because those are bodies of work. If you're talking about Impressionism or other things thereafter, where the unique gesture of the artist are the most highly prized things in the work. So that if you begin to play with that idea of originality, you play with the whole system of values behind the works themselves. It's significant to say that a great deal of art does not have that quality, that a great deal of art was made on, if you will, commissioned by artists. Moholy-Nagy's two enameled plates that are at the Museum of Modern Art represent exactly the same design, executed in two different sizes according to his specifications. And for him, part of the point was to stress that originality of the artist's touch, of the artist's hand, was not in fact a value he prized. It was not a value he was promoting. That new art in the new era would be of a different kind. It's worth mentioning also that the old studio systems of the pre-modern times, be it Rubens or Rembrandt's or others, involved many hands at work on works which would then be signed off on by the artist, but maybe only partly painted by the artist, and in some cases barely painted by the artist. And so when we think about this particular case, we have to see this case in the context of many other art values which are highly contested by historical example, and moreover, are currently being contested by younger artists who have entered into the play of what is original and what is fake in order to sort of plumb the depths of our preconceptions. So one question is to say, if we get fixated on cases like this, do we in fact begin to reassert the primacy of things which are in fact not necessarily primary for all artists in all situations? Do we in fact go back to a definition of art which is more conservative than the art that was being made, or at least more conservative than the art that is now being made? For what it's worth, I would just say I worked briefly for Siqueiros, who was Pollock's teacher. And when I did so, I worked in Mexico on a mural painting. It was a dreadful mural painting, but I had a hand in it. And on the scaffoldings, way above the ground where Siqueiros was shouting out directions, all the artists who worked for him had little paintings going, made with his materials in his manner, that they would then sell to the hotelier who was financing the whole project. So in a way, I was doing what the assistants of Rembrandt, on a much lower level, the assistants of Rembrandt and Rubens were doing. The idea of the categorical original is actually an anachronism now, and was never the dominant way of thinking about art through most of Western art history, and for that matter, most of Asian history. So that's one thing. Now, in this particular set of circumstances, the conversation again also tends to go towards the transactional relationship. Who is cheated by whom? Who is the victim relative to who is the victimizer? Who is the criminal and who is the innocent? I think one can fairly say after these presentations, there's almost nobody who's totally innocent. The desire to believe an implausible proposition makes you at least party to a fraud, right? You may be an innocent party to the fraud in the sense that you're not consciously doing this, but if you don't ask questions, if caveat emptor does not apply in your relationships with all these things, if the willingness to believe that somebody you like is in fact probably maybe even a crook, I mean, why do they call them confidence people? Because one expresses confidence in them. They inspire confidence, and they use that confidence against the people whom they cheat. But the desire to not believe your alarm signals, your sort of bullshit detector, is a big, big problem here. And I think that's something that needs to be considered. But anyway, this is a definition of a sort of transactional relationship. And the story is about those people who did wrong things, those people who were taken advantage of, etc. But they're all of them party to an economic transaction in this case. Now, I would like to sort of second something that Adam raised, which is, what is the public interest in cases like this? I think it's far more important than the particular dollars and cents lost by people who have an awful lot of them to begin with. And also by the people who are gulled in the business of art. Many of us have different relations and opinions about the business, but once you get into business, you're in a different realm. But what about the public? Okay, these kinds of cases inspire profound cynicism in a public which is largely disinclined to take any modern and contemporary art seriously. If this case had taken place in London, it would have been on every tabloid cover for weeks and weeks and months and months and months. When I did the Robert Ryman show with Nick Sirota in London, we made the covers quite regularly. And lots of mockery was unleashed, and a play was actually written about that exhibition, or at least about that artist. So that when you have cases like this, they absolutely underscore a cynicism about art that many people have already. It's not the automatic response of people who are non-artists, but these cases provide fuel to the flames. And I think this is something that really is the ultimate cost of this. I can't actually say I'm very sorry for a hedge funder who lost $17 million buying something he didn't investigate from somebody who didn't really play fair with him. It's too bad, but he can afford it. But I think the public cannot afford the equivalent loss of faith in the seriousness of museums and of artists. That they cannot afford. And lastly, the artists cannot do it. The artists in most cases are dead. Not all, but in most cases are dead. I mean, there are always fakes being presented to artists, and artists will then, if they wish to, strike them off. But there are now legal liabilities for artists as well as for scholars if you cancel out somebody's value investment by simply saying, no, this is wrong. And then if somebody says, well, I can prove to you how it's right, and they have a certain number of circumstantial things, they can do to the artist what was done to IFAR, what was done to a lot of people who were here, be pressured to yield, to give up the fight, because it's just too expensive to pursue it. But in any case, if the artists are the victims, and if they're directly the victims in that way, but there's also the body of work that they create. When you begin to proliferate the number of fakes, you pollute the catalog. You pollute the definition of what an artist's work has been. Now, as a curator, I'm often interested in anomalous things made by artists. When I did the Richter show at the Modern, I put in a couple of paintings and people sort of scratched their head at it. So, what's this there for? It's a minor thing. It's ugly. It's not the Richter we know and love. And I put them there partly because I thought they were actually not so bad. But I also put them there because I thought those anomalies are part of artistic process. Unless you can show things that don't fit the definition of an artist, that is the public, commercial, museological definition of that artist, you misunderstand where creativity comes from. Supposing suddenly all of the Vache paintings of Magritte had emerged, and somebody presented one of those to the public and said, I've got a whole new body of work by Magritte that had not been documented. And if we didn't know, in fact, that he made those paintings, that he did it out of a spirit of perversity akin to what Picabia and others did, supposing we were in that, we would have an utterly different understanding of that artist. And I think most serious artists have had their Vache periods or have made their Vache works of one kind or another. So if you create catalogs that are streamlined, consistent catalogs of work, you are also creating catalogs which lie. About artistic process, about artistic value, and so on. Failures are important, and all artists make failures. So under circumstances where most forgers tend to reproduce things that look pretty much like the things that are known to be true, if you suddenly increase the number of things like that, that shows the artist creating a brand, for example. So even if it really is a plausible fake that you might like to have in your house, it says something about the artist's implement. And I'll say here, again, personal information. I had a relative who owned a very fine analytic cubist Picasso. And when she died, she left me her copy of it. And she was an artist without any talent whatsoever for creative things, but she had a marvelous talent for faking these pictures. And she did it for very good reasons. When she loaned them to exhibitions, she wanted to have the real one at home. so to speak. Or vice versa. I once got a call from Ponte Sultan to ask me whether or not the Convaler portrait in Chicago was the Convaler portrait or my aunt's version of it. Anyway, for years I've been living with a fake. And I like this fake, and I enjoy looking at it, but I know it's a fake, and I also know in what particular ways it contains less information than the real one does. And I've had this question asked me very recently, actually, in a conference in Athens, where some people said, well, what's the big deal? After all, we can do reproductions that are dead on the thing that you're there. Well, a painting, as you know, and a sculpture for that matter, or a print or anything else, is not just the image. If you can produce the image to scale in another medium, you are still dealing with another thing entirely. And how exactly light hits the surface, to go back to Ryman, the way in which he lays the paint down is very important to how his works look. How exactly that happens matters, and if what you've got is a fake that reproduces that badly, or a totally translated version photographically that doesn't reproduce it at all, then the public that sees it has no idea why this artist is valuable. Anyway, I'm not going to go on and on, but I would just simply try to say this, that as we look at these questions, we should remember that we are looking at a slice of art history for which a certain set of values were developed, but they are not the values of art for all time, and it's easy to point to places where they are not. And therefore, when we use terms like originality, we have to use them advisedly, and we have to use them sparingly, I think, also. They are absolutely essential for the work that these experts do, but they're not actually what people go to look for when they go to see paintings. They do look at not the authenticity of the artist's mark, they look at the mark, you know? And I think that's another thing. You don't admire the performance of a painting, you, in most cases anyway, you admire the painting for what it is. And I think that's, you know, one. The other side of it is simply to say that, again, it is not about who wins and who loses in the market. It's about who wins and loses over the long history of art in the experience of art. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. That was a very, really interesting presentations, and all from a different perspective. There's a lot of points that I'd like to follow up with. I want to give the audience, we'll take questions, but let me start with two things that just seem to be at the center of this and kind of run through all of the presentations. And one is just this dilemma, and I think, Sharon, you probably held another IFAR panel on this once before, but on authentication. We're now in a situation where the foundations, the estates, nobody wants to authenticate anymore. And it seems we've just kind of hit this impasse at this point where you have even the lawyers who are often representing the estates or the foundations telling the experts don't say anything publicly. That happened in this case. And so what do we do? Where do, you know, who has the word? What is to say? What is something that's authentic or not? And how do we get around this legal conundrum? Go ahead.
In one way, there should be some kind of price to be paid for harassment of scholars and experts in the proper pursuit of their discipline. Penalty to be paid up front, you know, when you attack them, if you have no grounds for the attack. I mean, you know, in British law, I believe, if you sue somebody for slander and you don't prevail in your case, you lose all the court costs plus whatever penalties. If people do these kinds of frivolous suits, there ought to be a similar kind of penalty system. But you know, among other things, I was on the Warhol board at the time of the big suits over the putative Warhol, and I am the president of Robert Ryman's Foundation. And in both situations, we were very cautious, are very cautious about getting into authentication. But both artists, Warhol much more so than Ryman, have been forged a good deal. And again, how do you look at that work if you know that the chances of something in front of you is not that work? And partly because both artists used techniques that were not primarily about the hand. You know?
Mm-hmm. Frankly, I think that's a very legitimate question and is at the core of a lot that's happening and going forward. We do forget that years ago there weren't artist estates and foundations, that they are a relatively new thing in and of themselves. When we were founded, there were very few. Then they started to proliferate in the 80s and 90s, and now they're pulling back. I personally think, and Jack Flam, who wasn't able to be here tonight, would be the first person to say this, I think they do have a responsibility to opine on the works of their artists. I think they have the responsibility for the integrity of their artist's work. But many people don't agree with me, and I understand the fear. It is a legitimate fear. I explained in my talk, we weren't even sued. I should say that at no point during this entire thing did Knoedler, well, our client was Mr. Levy, but we made Knoedler sign an agreement as well, not to sue, which turned out to be one of the smartest things I ever did. Because although we didn't know he had made that agreement, and I assumed the work would be authentic, we made them sign it when I had not even seen the work. I had no knowledge of the work. I just knew that if there would be a work of that value, and we said it wasn't good, which I didn't anticipate, that he would go back and want to get his money back, and I didn't want to risk that kind of suit. That said, we were never sued. Mr. Levy was made whole, so he didn't sue, and Knoedler never even threatened to sue. They badmouthed us, but at no point did they threaten to sue us. At some point, you have to own up to a responsibility. If no one takes a responsibility on this, I think it's going to be an even bigger problem. So I happen to be someone who feels the artists' estates and foundations do have a responsibility. We did a program after the Warhol disbanding, and the Liechtenstein Foundation said it wasn't going to do it anymore. Warhol had just stopped, and others are following suit or never getting into it. I understand why, but it is a predicament. And by the way,
I just want to point out that, as John, I'm sure, could tell us, that even getting someone to sign a piece of paper saying they won't sue does not necessarily stop them from suing. This is the good old USA, and everyone thinks he has his right to a day in court. But even the legislation that failed to pass for the third year in a row in New York State to protect specialists when giving opinions, in the first year, that legislation had a provision, just as Rob Storr suggested, and is the European model, that if you sue the specialist and fail, you would have to pay the legal fees. When it came back the second year, that was already out, and certainly the third year, and even so, it didn't pass in the legislation. John.
We were, our local bar association was a prime mover behind that legislation, and the attorney's fees provision was a really important part of it for exactly the reasons that Professor Storr said. It's because it is very expensive. The Warhol Foundation reportedly spent $7 million defending itself against those accusations, using the same law firm, coincidentally, that Ann Friedman used. So I did think that was important. The good news, and that's why lawyers do say, boy, you should really be careful. And the College Art Association, which is the professional association of art scholars, says, don't do it. So we continue to try and press that legislation. The good news is that the experts and scholars almost always win, and there are cases where they recover attorney's fees. But it's hard, and it's also, as anyone who's been sued or even subpoenaed can tell you, it's a miserable situation. But I do think it's important for experts to do that, knowing that they'll win. Hopefully, they can get some help. There is some insurance available, but it is difficult, and that's why we want to create an environment where scholars can set it and also get it wrong. It's okay for scholars to get it wrong as long as they're not, as was the case with a couple of folks in Knoedler, as long as they're not making money under the table or without being disclosed who are scholars. The scholars should be protected, and they do usually win, but it would be better. We just have a different culture here in terms of legal fees. The legislature believes that it's very rare that people should win. We want to encourage people to take a chance.
I'm trying to put something in about the politics and public perception. During the Warhol case, there was a lot of ink spilled over the proposition that basically the Warhol Foundation was trying to manipulate and control the market in order to maximize its assets. which was rubbish, frankly. It was giving away its assets at that time because almost nothing was left of prime quality, and so they were giving away Polaroids and prints to smaller institutions that could not afford them. Otherwise, the income from the reserves that they built up was going to artists. So the choice that Warhol made was not in favor of maximizing its assets. It was in how you allocate those assets. And paying $7 million or whatever it was, I don't recall, to lawyers to defend yourself rather than dispensing that amount during at that point, rather grim kind of economic situation for artists was a difficult choice to make. So I think the public doesn't see this. The public sees the art world where capital moves up and stays up. But in fact, many of these foundations are in the business of bringing it back down and splitting it up.
The other point that I wanted to ask you all about is the very nature of the art world business, which is a lack of transparency. If you speak to prosecutors, they will note that art now has become a favored business to do money laundering in, because as we see, it's, you can write private collection just as Knoedler did, and it covers a multitude of sins. And it's understood that buyers don't necessarily want to reveal their identity, or sellers. We see that even at public auctions. And so, Adam, let me start with you. Is there something in the nature of the art world that this penchant for secrecy and privacy perhaps really goes against other more pressing interests?
Well, it's an interesting question. I think it brings up a whole nother arena, which one could also describe as the conversation of private sales in galleries, privately owned galleries, versus sales in the public arena at auction. And people tend to say that, well, something that's happening at auction is more transparent than something is happening privately. And actually, it isn't transparent, it's just public. So I think there's a greater misunderstanding about this entire concept. I do think that in the next couple of years, this is something that's going to reveal itself more and more in terms of our business. And I think it's something that we are making available to the public in order to create greater confidence and a greater understanding of the nature of the relationship between the artist and the gallery, and then the gallery and then the client. I mean, we're the middleman often between the foundation and the collector, the estate, the trust, and the collector. So we have to do well by both sides. And I think that's something that people are going to understand more and more in the next couple of years. And I think the mistrust of auctions is also going to bring much more confidence back into the gallery, despite what happened here in a very anomalous situation. And this is not just an art world issue. This is something that happens in all businesses, and I think that we have to always remember that. I mean, we all know the name Bernard Madoff, and he certainly wasn't an art dealer.
You talked about, yes, of course, there's crooks in every business, but there are certain practices, I think, in the art world that makes it perhaps easier. And no doubt this is an anomaly, and certainly the scale of this was much larger. But, Knoedler was a very respected art gallery. And I think, Robert, I really have to take issue with your point about how at least some of the buyers, although, yes, the violin for somebody who can afford a $17 million painting is quite small, but nonetheless, I think it was completely reasonable to go to a gallery that has a reputation and assume that you're not going to go to Tiffany's and say, well, I'm going to hire an expert to tell me that this is a real diamond. You're assuming it's a real diamond because you went to Tiffany's. And so the problem with what you said is that it's only after the fact, Adam, about that if we know one of these reputable dealers is not being truthful.
I take your point, but I do think buying things where you have no history of the piece moving through the system is just stupid. And it's the kind of stupidity for which I feel very little pity.
Well, On behalf of some of those folks who bought, first of all, one of them I will say did buy something that was going to be given to charity that would have been worth over $10 million was going to be given to a children's charity, and these folks were not stupid. They're very smart people. They are not art historians. They're not people necessarily schooled in that, and they did have information. They were told, as all these laws, they were told by a very reputable gallery that had been around for more than a century, that they knew who the person was. The person was a important Swiss collector, getting it directly from the studio. That it had come through respected advisor, and they didn't know all the bad things. So they were given very clear representations that they were entitled to believe. And that's the question we have to ask ourselves is that the kind of art market we want to have, where you can go into a gallery, like a reputable gallery like Adam was talking about, and if someone tells you something, you can believe it's true. Now, knock wood, the judge in the Knoedler case said, yes, that's good enough to have reliance on. So there are good reasons and bad reasons for the lack of transparency. Art dealers want to protect their commercial interests. If I tell you who my seller is, then how do I know the next time, or this time even, you're not going to go around me and do with that? So that happens. And sellers are sometimes, because they're selling very valuable paintings, they're either shy or concerned about security or other reasons. They don't want to be known. But whatever the reasons, there's no way for most buyers to know who is selling it. And every once in a while, you do get something that comes out of the blue, as you have a Richter you've never seen before, or that he gifted to someone or something like that. So these folks did have information. They did get warranties. In the case, for example, of the Rosales, they got a letter from the gallery saying exactly this, and many people did. They got a list of experts who supposedly viewed the painting, ranging from the giants like Kirk Varnedoe to Jack Flam. So they weren't just sort of walking in off the street and buying it. They did get lots of representation, which they were entitled to believe, I think.
But that brings up the question of the fact that the so-called Romeo attribution has got to be a flat-out lie. And since it was a flat-out lie, why has there been no prosecution of the people who purveyed that lie?
What's this?
There we agree.
Let's also
And
remember.
besides, there are people who have been prosecuted, and I'm told there's still an ongoing investigation. But there are questions about why there aren't prosecutions. There are answers, I'm sure, but the representation that the owner was known, was alleged to be false. We never got a resolution of that because all these cases have settled. But those were the allegations. Yeah.
I mean, what I find very interesting is that, and somebody mentioned it, I think it might have been you, John, when you were speaking, is this notion about a gut instinct, too. And we've all read Malcolm Gladwell, and we've all read what Thomas Hoving said about looking at a certain piece of Egyptian art when all the documentation said it was right, and he absolutely knew it wasn't, and he was proven true. It's interesting. What Martha Parrish said during the trial, I think, is something that keeps coming back to me, because as a dealer, when you get a work of art in that has a questionable provenance, or there's something that doesn't match up, you really do your best to work it out. And you call sources, and you trace it, and that's our job. And you engage scholars if they're willing to work with you. But when you see 30 or 40, you run like hell.
But let's go back to the role of the expert, because I think we really have the spectrum here of scholars who did exactly what you would expect them to do, look very carefully. But even, let's put aside connoisseurship for the moment, even technically, Jamie, there were two other, I think, John, as you point out, two other experts who do what you do, who fudged the conclusions or suggested that they came out differently. Connoisseurs, there were some experts, some of them well regarded, who looked at the works and said they thought they were true. I mean, some of them were good fakes, obviously, and they can be misleading. So, and then there were clearly scholars who had a financial interest, whether a direct one because they were making a commission off the sale from both the buyer and seller in some cases, but or were in the employ of the gallery in some other way. So, Jamie, just to start with you, where do we go? In terms of the competing experts, because if you talk to juries afterwards in these kind of cases, their view is kind of throw up their hands. Well, one expert says this and one expert says that. What am I to believe?
So, in the United States, the best way to assess a technical scientific expert is to find out if the person is a member of the American Institute for Conservation, and if they're a peer-reviewed member. In other words, are they a fellow of the American Institute for Conservation? Because fellows like me have extensive experience, and in addition to promising to follow the code of ethics, we've demonstrated adherence to that over a long career. Unfortunately, there are 2 of us in the country that fit that bill. So there are just not a lot of people who have the expertise, the instrumentation, the temperament outside of museums. There are a lot of me in museums, but they can't do this kind of work for reasons that the museum prevents them from doing it, and that they were born with more common sense than I have, and they realize, why would I do that? So there are just not that many good people around that do it. But there's simple things you can do. There's simple technical things that you can do. Just look at the work. If it's a work by Mark Rothko, look and see if it has a white ground from the 1950s. All of that information was published at the time that Anne Friedman was selling those works. All you had to do was pick up a scholarly book on Mark Rothko and read that during that time he was preparing colored transparent grounds with animal glue, not opaque white primers with acrylic. And it was hiding in plain sight. Often it's just the problem that people don't look closely enough and they don't assess what they're looking at. Most of the works that I looked at in this case, there were glaring problems hiding in plain sight. Most of the works had dirt that was spread across the surface. On some of them, there was Kleenex or paper towel fibers stuck in the paint from wiping the wet dirt off. But the way you could tell it was wiped on was that it was directional. If the paint has texture like speed bumps on the road, the dirt that was being applied was building up on one side of the brushwork. Dirt doesn't fall and deposit that way. So your best friend in that case is not to call a scientist like me, it's to get a hold of a good conservator. Conservators who have a lot of experience working with different artists or working with different materials, and have them do a careful technical examination of the condition of the work. But do not ask them to opine on authenticity. It's not what conservators do, and I was a conservator before I was a scientist. Unfortunately, that's what happened in the Knoedler case. The conservator who examined all the paintings for Friedman didn't stop at this is a work in remarkably good condition for its apparent age, but went on to opine about what a great example of the artist's work it was. They went too far. So find a good conservator, look closely, and call someone like me once in a while if you need to.
Yeah, there are things you can do. I mean, you put out a checklist once, which is one of the things that Knoedler's lawyers put in the book. See, there's a checklist, and none of these people found it. Of course, I wrote it after the Knoedler forgery, and it's all what I think people can do, not what they should have to do. I think they should be able to believe what art dealers tell them, but you can research the provenance. You can, Knoedler never went to the Osorio Foundation until after the IFAR report. So you can go to catalog raisonnés, you can consult scholars, you can put all these things together, and when appropriate with the forensic science. So it's not like people buying art or museums accepting art are completely without resources. It's a little harder because you don't have a central authority sometimes who's willing to do it. But there are good, solid things that can be done. So you can have a high degree of confidence when you're dealing with reputable people and good information. The problem is Knoedler was putting out bad information, sometimes from disreputable people.
I just want to add something about that, the specialists. One of the things that came out at trial was that many specialists names were invoked, if you will, who later claimed that they did not make those statements, give those opinions. There were others who did give opinions, there's no question, but that many, and I certainly knew of some that came out at the deposition that were used, that didn't say it and couldn't have said and wouldn't have said that the works were good, and on the witness stand, Jim Coddington said it, other people said that their names were used, but they had not.
There was
commented.
also an artful, there were, at least in some cases, an artful use of language such as viewed by,
Yes.
which is, they looked at it, but then you get, which brings you around to the other issue of silence, that people, many of those may have thought they didn't look right, but didn't want to speak out. Robert?
I was just going to say, part of what she did, and then one more thing. The fact that you view something and don't say doesn't mean that you say yes. And I know numbers of people who were invited to look, gave no opinion, but also gave no negative opinion, and Friedman probably interpreted that to her benefit wherever she possibly could.
Well, she did. She, in fact, she testified under oath that she did that if people didn't say anything negative, she assumed that was confirmation.
Which is crazy. I basically refuse to get in situations like this because of this. In that case, it's not a chilling effect of the kind that I think has to do with scholarship. I think it does raise a question of whether anybody who does what we do as curators should be involved in these kinds of situations to begin with. If you're taking money from all sides, it's very hard to keep things straight. So my answer is just a categorical no.
Unless it's right.
I haven't been asked yet. I'd just like to say one other thing about my earlier comments. I was being polemical to a person that I grant you it is unfair to the people who trusted a reputable or supposedly reputable establishment. But I do think that when you're dealing with business, the art world is not the exception to other businesses. And if you express trust in ways you would never do in the business that made you all that money, then you were partly to blame for your own failure.
Yes, and actually that many lawyers have said to me, maybe John, I don't remember you too, when I was covering this, that some of these are very savvy business people who would have never accepted the kind of assurances in any other endeavor that they did in this case. Adam, you were going to say something.
A number of these people also hired private art advisors. It's sort of like hiring a private prosecutor to go after your case. They were financially compensated by Knoedler, and I think these people were put in a position to protect their clients, and I don't think that they necessarily acted in a way that they should have. And that opens another conversation about the role of that entire sort of genre.
Right. If art advisors are also getting a piece of the commission,
Yep.
I mean, then that...
But that art advisor should have picked up the book on Rothko if they didn't know better and done some research.
Perhaps everyone or a lot of people were simply blinded by the stature of Knoedler. I said earlier, and you said it in print, if it were a different gallery or a different conduit, if it were Glafier or Rosales alone, this couldn't have happened. Forget anything else. The sheer imprimatur of this, it is like the Tiffany's analogy, assuaged an awful lot of people's doubts. And then the second point, which I said I wanted to return to, that so many people saw only one or two works. Or knew of only a small group. And this was playing with a limited deck of cards, really, because someone else knew there were a lot of works. And there is a very different attitude when there are a lot of works by a lot of different artists.
Yes.
And even some of the research, as great as Jamie is, and I think Jamie's terrific, we use him, but some of his findings were benefited, if you will, by the fact that he was able to see works by several different artists and see anomalies or anachronisms that just made absolutely no sense. It wouldn't have made sense with one artist, but when you see the same ones reappear across the board with several artists, but almost no one else other than the gallery that knew it was getting it, would have had that opportunity to do it.
Now, I'm going to open it up to questions in one moment, but just to follow up, Sharon, on what you were saying, that brings us back again to this issue of privacy, because there was a museum, in fact, that was given one of these fake paintings. They didn't know about any of the others, so. Right. So it's the same thing. So again, it comes back to this. There's, I don't know that there's necessarily an answer to it, but certainly that contributes to the fact that nobody did know that other than the people at Knoedler. Robert?
I was thinking, well, Chrysler gave a whole lot of Knoedler horrors to the museum as well. I mean, this is not the first time any of this has happened. But let me just make one. Among the losses, again, are the chances to have interesting disagreements about the authenticity of works of art. Rembrandt's Polish writer is in and out of the catalog. The Girl in the Door is in and out of the catalog. Those debates will never be settled. They're very interesting and very enlightening in terms of the works of art involved. And again, the whole fixation on these issues, it shouldn't just be legal financial.
Yes, but to that Rembrandt, there we're dealing with issues of Rembrandt and studio, or Rembrandt and follower, and misattributions as opposed to deliberate fakes, and that's in fact what you often get with the old masterworks.
Okay, let's open it up to some questions. I don't know if there is a mic. There is. Okay, great. Let's start with you. Is that on?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, and if you don't object, if you could identify yourself before asking the question.
I can't hear.
I can't
hear. Is the mic on?
Okay. All right. Well, if you could speak up, we'll listen carefully, and if you don't hear it in the back, I will repeat your question.
Ms. Cohen and Professor Storer a question, and then Mr. Cahill a question. The first question is, you identified the profession of the 17 million buyer. As I understand it, there were no institutional buyers, or i.e. museums, who participated in this fraud. The 17 million one, what relevance is it, what he was doing for a living? And there was kind of a remark made as if the size of the amount indicated that he was wealthy, and perhaps the crime would be not so onerous to a smaller buyer or to a public institution. Could you ferret out or mete out the implications?
Okay, so the question, if you did hear the first part, was...
second question.
Okay, well, let's start with one, and then we'll open it up to other people. But basically, the question was about, is the buyer relevant? If they're wealthy, if they're not wealthy, if there are museums. There were museums, I think, that were, in fact, involved in negotiating for some of the paintings, if they didn't actually happen. But does the buyer matter, the wealth or not, in terms of the crime?
Well, Knoedler tried to make it matter in the lawsuits and said, these are wealthy people, sophisticated people. They should know better. I don't think it does, because they're not. This is not what they do. They're not buying financial instruments in this case. But museums are affected by this, because very often, and another nice thing about it, very often these wealthy folks, going back to the Medicis, give these things away to museums, and they're often consulting with museums. And in one case, wasn't this particular set of fakes, but a museum did wind up with one. So museums can and do get duped, as do nonprofits, as do people, as I said in one case, buying with the intention of giving it to a nonprofit or museum.
No, but I was hoping that they would mete out the implications of theirs as opposed to what you're saying now.
Can I respond to what you asked me? I say this without any irony. Some of my best friends are billionaires. And none of them would buy works at that price without more due diligence on their own part.
Okay, let's, before we do a second question, let's see if there's other people in the audience who have questions. And if not, we'll come back. There anyone else with a question up front here?
Yes.
My name is Jim Reinish. I'm an art dealer. maybe I'm naive about the process, but the evidence which you all have talked about and that we've all read about seems overwhelming. All these cases that are coming to court are civil cases. I'm just curious what your opinion is, why there has been no criminal case brought against Friedman and Knoedler by the U.S. Attorney's Office?
John, I'm sure, has interesting thoughts on this and probably knows more about it than I do. But I can say this. Number one, the resources that prosecutors have, federal or whether it's New York, are limited, and they have to make decisions about what they're going to. In terms of the FBI's, the unit that is devoted to art is tiny. And in fact, I don't think if this had the scale of it that it ever would have gotten anywhere. As we can see, these cases are still 2011, I think, was when I first wrote about it, so when it was public, but these cases have gone on for 15 years. They take a long time, they're very expensive, they take a lot of resources, and in a criminal case, remember, the standard of proof is different. It's beyond a reasonable doubt, which is not in a civil case. So where you come down to, if you have to prove you're a prosecutor and you have to prove a conspiracy that, let's say, for example, Knoedler or Ann Friedman knew beyond a reasonable doubt that, as opposed to being negligent or stupid or, duped herself, that's a tough standard of proof. Are you going, most prosecutors don't want to put all of this time and money in, particularly when you've got other cases, if you really don't think you have a very excellent chance of winning it.
Yeah, so I will say that the federal prosecutors and the FBI they do have limited resources, and they devoted a lot of resources to this. They did a massive investigation. They did a lot of work. They helped out a lot. It was the thing that really broke the case was the discovery of the Spanish financial records of Rosales, which is what got her in jail and what got her did. So I don't want to say anything that suggests that they didn't. They worked hard. They did a good job there with the FBI agency. I think I and just about every other civil lawyer that worked on the case had the exact same view you do. Boy, it sure seems like beyond a reasonable doubt to us, and they assured us they were taking a hard look at it. Last time I heard, they were still taking a hard look at it, but they have their own, they have their own discretion, they have their own resource issues, and I'm not sure where that wound up, but that's certainly a question a lot of lawyers asked, and certainly the victims asked that question a lot. And are still asking it.
In the indictment, they said, and others known and as yet unknown, when in the last indictment. Well, they left their avenue open.
Other questions up here, up front?
If we're looking at, my name is David Darcy. I'm a journalist. If we're looking at, yeah, right, not even recovering. If we're looking at some of the broader effects of the Knoedler case, can we look at this in the context of what happened in the early 1990s when a lot of attention was placed on works of art that were seized, say, from 1933 to 1945? People discovered that not only was there something called provenance, but it was, as Rob was suggesting obliquely a little bit, that it was their responsibility to find out what they were buying, and there were ways of doing that, which the museums at the time were very resistant to acknowledging. Are we looking at this as a lesson for what people need to know when they're buying modern art? Because I agree, again, with Rob, that if you're paying $17 million for a work of art, you can afford to have somebody look at the science, you can afford to have connoisseurs look at this, you can afford to have someone look at provenance, and this is a reminder that seems extremely obvious right now. But my question is this another wave of recognition that that much more due diligence has to be conducted?
Adam, why don't you take that to begin with?
What I think is interesting is that the information that was provided to the buyers came from the Knoedler Gallery. The buyers did not take it upon themselves to necessarily go out and do the due diligence in order to research and find this information. And I think if they wanted to avoid it, perhaps they could have worked together with the gallery to say, hey, I read this book on Rothko. I don't understand why this is here. I think we live in a very sped-up world where acquisitions happen much quicker, and I think there are a lot more parties involved. And I think that the topic of this evening is 2020 hindsight, what we've learned from it. And I think we've learned that everybody needs to take responsibility for a transaction on both sides of the coin, and you work together and you bring in parties independently, and you make it happen if it can, and if there's resistance or questions, then you let it go.
And not every one of these works sold for $17 million. That was the most expensive, and some sold in the 1990s for far less, in the six figures. And it's not that they weren't bought by people with means, but the question we have to ask ourselves, is that the kind of art market we want to have, where you walk into an art gallery and you want to say, I just want to introduce you to my friend James Martin, here's my lawyer John Cahill, here's a provenance researcher, and that's my brother-in-law, but he's also a connoisseur in the works of Jackson Pollock. And I would say the answer is no, and I think that we as a society have said that. Back in the 60s when Louis Lefkowitz was an attorney general and when IFAR was getting started, there was fraud in the art market, and there were fraud in different ways. There were multiples being put on. And Lefkowitz said, let's change the law. Let's change the law so that if an art dealer gives you an invoice that says it's by Jackson Pollock's, gosh darn it, they have to stand behind that. That's a warranty, and people have to stand behind. And if they tell you something that's not true, for instance, one of the experts said, we know who David Herbert was. We know he was there. He said to Jack Levy after IFAR had said it was fake, and that turns out to be true. That's a fraud, and we're going to hold you to that. So the issue we have to grapple with is, should we really put this on the buyers, and is that the kind of art market we want, where New York is the center of the art world? I think the answer to that is no. We want people to go into a reputable gallery and get reputable information. It's not that I don't suggest to clients, and I make a living to some extent doing this, saying, hey, if you want to do this, let's get a good contract. We can check, with the services to see if it's a World War II painting and some things. But at the end of the day, the people I think who should be taking accountability are the people who are selling it, and the good ones do. There were people here, even, there were dealers here who said, boy, I feel lousy about it, but here's your $1 million back. That's one of the things that was shocking about this case was, and I'll name them, Richard Feigen, one of the advisors, Jamie Frankfurt. There are people who, you could say they made mistakes, Manny Silverman, but they gave the money back. But even after this entire fraud was revealed, New York Magazine has a headline, I'm the central victim. Okay, but these other victims lost money. They're victimized in a different way. You have millions, they lost millions. Could you give it back, please? And they didn't. So that's what I think is shaking the art market a little bit, and but it's a legitimate point, but I don't think it's the art market we want to have. It's a different art market.
I'm sorry. I think that, I bought millions of dollars of art from Museum of Modern Art on behalf of the public that would then see it, right? And my job as a curator was precisely to make sure that I bought something that was what it said it was. I don't see why we want to make a cozy art world where people who are buying privately don't have to at least do some of what it is that I did routinely on the published behalf. How cozy do we want this art world to be?
I think it's a reasonable assumption to assume that any market is not entirely the market that you want to have. That's
Okay.
Sure, and museums have bought, as Mr. Darcy mentioned, museums have bought things, including maybe even the Museum of Modern Art, if I think correctly, that did have issues of provenance or that you crazy. It happens. The question, who should be accountable and who should pay the price for that when it happens. I'm not saying that people should be naive, but if you're dealing with a reputable dealer getting some straightforward promises and information, I think you should be able to count on that. Like as you do when you go into Tiffany's.
Just one additional note on that. I'm not sure that all the expertise would be available to individual buyers anyway. For example, we will only work for the owner, so to protect us legally. So if it's someone who wants to purchase, there would have to be an agreement among several parties that we would do it. We will not take a work on other than from the owner who has to sign the agreement.
Other questions, because we're running out of time here. So that gentleman over there.
My name is Aaron Milrod. I'm a lawyer in Canada and a member of the board of IFAR. Were any of the artists' estates interested in taking part in this and trying to put forward their concerns about frauds being sold in the name of the artists?
Well, actually, as he's not here tonight, Jack Flam at the Daedalus Foundation, which was Motherwell's foundation, really started this whole thing, and they made a kind of original sin in that they did authenticate or indicated that they were going to authenticate one of the Motherwells, but when they realized it, and they saw actually not one but two but seven, they started to ask questions, and it was basically because Jack started asking around to different foundations that this knowledge pool that we were talking about, that they suddenly realized it wasn't one artist or two artists, but a whole bunch from the same source, that the really investigation began. But
I think somebody would want to bring an action under the Copyright Act.
That's a whole other legal kettle of fish. Jamie, were you going to say something about?
Didn't the PKF Foundation do that with the Matter paintings? No? There wasn't a concern about the Matter paintings not being copyrighted by the Paula Krasner Foundation?
They wouldn't give their permission to
publish
them in the catalog, yes.
They don't have the copyright.
Right.
The forger does.
Right. Patient has the copyright.
He's got some claims here, including for some of our presentations tonight.
Okay, well, I think it's actually after 8. Oh.
Just one more quick comment.
Okay.
Sorry, this is Emily Reisbaum, and I just wanted to respond to that last question because I do have next to me Gretchen Diebenkorn Grant and Dick Grant, who saw the first works, the Diebenkorns, that Rosales brought to Knoedler, and they told Anne Friedman that the works were fake. And not fake. They said they were not right. They were not right, which we all know means that they were fake.
And Emily, you should just identify yourself as well.
I'm here with my partner, Greg Clarick, and we are the lawyers for Domenico and Eleanor Desolé, who tried the case.
I mean, that really goes back, the Diebenkorns really is the case where I think you talk about due diligence. It was very clear in the 1990s there were flags raised. The IFAR investigation was the most prominent of that, but there were definitely flags raised earlier.
As I said earlier, we didn't know that the Diebenkorn Foundation had raised those concerns about those Diebenkorns. We didn't even know there were Diebenkorns in the group.
Right.
Sure, and that was Knoedler's MO, to hide that information from others.
Anyway, thank you all so much for coming. This was really enlightening. Appreciate our panelists.